Welcome to the Select Board Candidate Debate. I'm Anne Marie Mahoney, your moderator for today's debate, and with me are our two candidates for Select Board, Paul Joy and Taylor Yates. Both newcomers, no incumbent, so this is going to be a very interesting debate. I'm looking forward to our conversation with both of these gentlemen today. Before we get started, just want to review the rules with everybody. I have a series of questions. We are not doing opening or closing statements. We want all the time to be spent on our topics and our discussion. When I ask the question, each of you will have 1 minute to answer. There will be a little beep, beep, beep when we hit the minute. I will be alternating which one of you asks and answers first, and hopefully I can keep track of that. There's only two of you. I should be okay with that. And each of you will have the opportunity to rebut or to add on to anything that's being said, and we'll give you about 30 seconds to do that. Just kind of raise your hand or give me the high sign. I am going to be doing this by topics, which is a little different from how I've been doing the other debates. And I am looking forward to an exchange between the two of you on some of these topics and some of the follow-on questions that I might be asking you. So with that, let's get started. My very first question, and we're going alphabetically, so Paul, you're going to answer first, is what skills, experience, and ideas will you bring to the Select Board?
Well, first of all, thank you, Anne Marie, and it's great to be here, certainly with you, Taylor. We've done a lot of amazing things together for the town. The number one thing, and the reason why I'm running, is because of the affordability crisis within the town. We see it with our taxes, we see it with our rising cost of healthcare, with our housing, and with many other aspects of the everyday average cost of living. What I bring to the table, and to answer your question directly, is real life skills associated with tackling these things, both as a teacher and now currently as a consultant for medium and large scale enterprises. I've done economic development both here within the town, I've helped to recruit businesses into the town, and I'm prepared to certainly do that if duly elected as a Select Board member.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome.
Taylor,
well, thank you, Anne Marie. Appreciate you having us here. So there's three things that I'm trying to bring up to the Select Board. So one is experience leading a high stakes, high visibility board. I chair two committees, the Vision 21 and the Planning Board, and let's just say one of them gets a lot more comment and commentary than the other.
I'll bet.
Yeah. The second thing is zoning and planning experience. I think a lot of our biggest issues over the next 3 years are going to be related to zoning and planning. And it would be helpful to round out the skill set on the Select Board with that kind of experience. And then the third is a track record of collaborative problem solving. So I think a lot of folks at home saw my work on the MBTA Communities Act, which passed town meeting by one of the largest margins of victory in the state, as well as my work on the Yes for Appointed Treasurer campaign, which passed with 70% of the vote.
Okay, all right. Thank you, gentlemen. Great start. Let me start with, again, a generalized question, things I hear on the street. Both of you are relative newcomers to Belmont, and certainly newcomers to running for elected office versus appointed office. How do you respond to those who say that you aren't quite seasoned enough yet? And Taylor, I'm going to start with you.
Sure, that's a great question. So the way I deal with this kind of with these kinds of jobs, and really any kind of job, is collaboratively. So I look for people who seem to have expertise in whatever it is we're working on, and people who have that really care about whatever it is we're working on. And I ask them, what do you think we should do? What do you think are the important dimensions of this problem? And that is part of why I was so successful in some of the things that I mentioned before, of being able to bring people together to push forward some of our toughest issues.
Okay, thank you. Paul.
I suppose for this particular question, as it relates to being newcomers within the town, it's true. So first of all, I was only elected as a town meeting member 3 years ago. This is the second time I'm running for town meeting as an incumbent, and obviously the first time as a Select Board candidate. The one thing I will say is when we go and do real meaningful reform, as it relates to the work on the Economic Development Committee, as well as every other committee and board, certainly across the town, it's important to gain expertise from those that have greater amounts of experience and to tease that out. I will be quite frank, as it relates to the work that I do professionally, we constantly go back out and do voice of the customer experience surveys. We're constantly listening to what it is that people are actually looking for. And when we do real meaningful economic development reform, it means having the right question, but knowing who to ask that question to in order to get the best possible answer.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, my first topic is going to be Belmont Center and the proposals for Belmont Center development. And I'm starting there because both of you have a stake in that, the zoning and the economic development. So it'll be interesting to hear your perspective. Let me just as a starter say, Belmont Center, the proposal, is a blend of both zoning and economic development. Planning Board is proposing what some people see as really dramatic changes for Belmont Center, taller buildings, maybe a residential component, elimination or adjusting the Claflin Street parking lot. And we're hearing concerns also about historic preservation, the old fire station there, the Locatelli buildings, et cetera. And are we being sensitive enough to the abutters on Pleasant Street? So that's a lot of what's going on. Plus, people are a little concerned about maybe bringing in more congestion, more traffic, and destroying the cozy feel of the center. So my first question is, what do you see as the real proposed economic benefit here? And Paul, I'm starting with you.
So my understanding is this is a planning board initiative, is that this would bring in between 6,000 and 30,000 new incremental square feet of development, if I have that correct. So that's not a small amount. It's not a huge amount relative to what we need to get to if you want an 8% or even a 10% commercial base. I guess my main concern that I have, and I've written about this, number one is the speed of which this proposal is moving forward, the questions around traffic mitigation, stormwater, et cetera. And I guess the other major thing that needs to be taken into consideration is the impact to local business. The question was asked last night at a meeting of the Belmont Center Business Association, what is the vision of what the town is trying to do? That ought to be answered in those types of meetings. So from my perspective, I applaud the role that the planning board is pursuing on all of this, but I will certainly question the ability or the impact. Right.
Thank you. Taylor, go ahead.
Sure. So let me just start by saying two things. Number one, there's a reason we call it planning and not grip it and rip it, right? So there's a lot of thought that goes into bringing that vision into focus. And that vision is basically how do we grow the commercial tax base and how do we make the streetscape in Belmont Center better? That, as a practical matter, is about height, the mix, and then also what do we do with the adjacent lots. So as we have gone through this process, we've held an extremely public process, and that input that we've received through that exercise has really materially shaped the direction that we've gone in, both in the building heights, what goes where, and we're going to answer some more of these questions as the project proceeds. On the timeline, this is all, the reason we're doing Belmont Center is based on a 2008 study of the center, and we're just giving town meeting a choice on that.
You can get back to that, no problem.
Sure.
Thank you. So, all right, let's expand a little bit on that. The process, the timing, you're mentioning 2008. Certainly a lot has happened since then in terms of development and growth, debt exclusions, et cetera, et cetera. Do you want to talk about, because already I'm losing track of this. Taylor, you're going to answer first on this, you're going to be able to follow on here a little bit.
Yeah.
Talk about maybe the timing if you wish, or let's get into what are the real costs. Who's going to assume the cost of any development and changes that are going to be made in the center?
Sure. So it's about the costs?
Costs or timing?
Yeah.
I mean, this is where I'd just like to see more of an exchange, whatever you want to talk about that you think our viewers need to hear.
Sure. So I'll answer two things that I think you brought up. Number one was, I think you made reference to the timeline and have things change. So when we started this process, one of the first things we did was a workshop. We reached out to members of the community and said, hey, come and share with us what you think. A lot of that just validated what we did in 2008. People said mostly the same thing. If they hadn't, I would have been the first person to say, okay, we got to hit pause and figure this out. And then on the cost, I mean, in terms of development, these are private entities, right? A developer would have to pay for any development in the center. And one of the things that we can do, if we're smart about it, is we can get developers to pay for community improvements. Most developers budget for community improvements in order to make the town more amenable to what they're trying to build. And then we can also design the zoning directly to incentivize the kind of things that we want in Belmont Center.
Okay, thank you. Paul, what are your thoughts?
So with regard to the overall cost and obviously to the timeline, my opinion of this is that it's being accelerated in a way that is, it needs more time in order for us to actually understand and realize what the real traffic impacts are going to be, what the real stormwater impacts are going to be, and certainly what the impacts of local businesses are going to be. Filene's or Macy's closed in 2013. You've talked about this.
I know, I'm
It was
still
one of your
mourning the
favorite
loss of
stores.
Filene's.
We're now today at a point where many of those storefronts, the bookstore, the Karma coming in, those storefronts are currently being filled up. We've been going through this for an entire year. Now we have, in another area of town, we have Cushing Square, which is obviously still empty. We ought to be incentivizing the filling of these particular spaces, not trying to do some type of other major redevelopment within this major commercial area.
Do you mind if I ask a question?
Absolutely.
What do you think would incentivize filling that space?
Number one, I think we ought to seriously look at parking requirements for all business areas. When we did restaurant reform, as you remember, we decided to go from one parking space for 2 seats to one space for 4 seats. In my opinion, we didn't go far enough. We ought to seriously look at eliminating all parking requirements for all businesses in all areas of the town.
So, do you mind if I comment
No,
on that?
go
So
ahead.
just as a real estate professional, I do not think that that is the limiter on that space. They actually have the parking garage there. I think what's going to limit that is that it just commercial leasing just takes longer than, say, like residential leasing. It will probably be, I suspect, like 6 to 18 months to fill that space, especially if they're looking for the right tenant. And we've actually, you don't need to be in real estate to understand that. You can look at what happened with Tate and the building next door to Tate. It just takes a long time to fill both.
Sure.
So I'm not saying that parking requirements are not important, but if you want to move the needle on commercial development, you have to think bigger than that.
Okay, so, but.
Can I-
Yes, absolutely, go ahead.
So in 2015, there was a study that was done associated with the fiscal impact of the town. And they looked at all the areas that we could potentially do major redevelopment and rezoning. I'm sure they looked at the 2008 study. I'm sure they did. And their recommendation was South Pleasant Street.
All right, good point. And let me add that South Pleasant Street has been on the table for discussion since the late 1990s.
Yeah.
And we've seen a lot of development there, a lot of very positive development.
Yeah.
I think the whole Subaru thing is a great addition there, as is other things.
Yeah.
Anyway, let me stick with Belmont Center for just
Sure.
another minute, and that is when we talk about studies, 2014, a spin-off of the Capital Budget Committee, Major Capital Projects Working Group, also did a study in conjunction with how do we address the police station, how do we address the DPW, the high school, the library, et cetera. And we focused in on the electric light building. And I'm not hearing a lot about the use of that building in the redevelopment of Belmont Center, understanding that you have the parcel, you may or may not want to keep that building, but you have the parcel.
Yeah.
But the town also owns the parcel on the other side of the tracks. So there is quite a lot of opportunity there. How would you respond to that? And Paul, you are first with this.
It's a great question. When we had the first kind of, I guess it was the charrette that we had, that parcel actually wasn't even included. Many of us were asking the question, well, why? And so we ended up drawing overlays of the train station, and we actually included that because obviously it is going to be an important part of whatever type of redevelopment is ultimately done. My understanding is it's an active transformer station. Belmont Light still needs additional time.
The 5 more years thing.
5 more years.
Yeah, they've been doing 5 more years for 15 years, just so we're clear.
That's what I'm sure it came up 6 years ago, right, when people were running for election. But at the same time, it has been taken off the demolition delay list, and so it should be something that we seriously look at, both from an RFQ perspective, maybe we lease it on a 50 or 100-year basis to somebody, or we sell the asset. as it relates to the town.
Okay.
Yeah.
Taylor, what would you do with the electric light site?
Yeah, we actually just talked about this on Tuesday at the planning board. So for starters, to be able to do anything, you have to create the zoning to allow whatever it is you want. Right now, the proposal is pretty modest, and I challenge that at the planning board because I look at that site and I say, well, it's not adjacent to any residential abutters, right? So
Beauty.
exactly, and it's got the train tracks and some forests on the other side. So if you want to do something more ambitious, it's a great place to do it. Separately, on Vision 21, we did an exercise of looking at all the town-owned property and putting together a draft proposal for what you could do with each parcel. And you can't do everything with every town parcel, but that's obviously an important one. We looked at the same kind of thing, like a ground lease or potentially just an outright sale, whatever, but that should be guided by whatever is best for the town.
Okay, all right. All set with that one? All right, I'm going to move on to zoning. We've had a lot of zoning chat in the last couple of years, and zoning issues have been prominent in both the local and the state, the regional press. I would ask you how well are we responding to state mandates while protecting our residents? So I'm hearing that residents are feeling, depending on where they live, which zones in the town, are feeling powerless in the face of the MBTA 3A rezoning, the ADUs, and this Belmont Center redevelopment. People are feeling like their neighborhoods are going to change dramatically and they have no control over that. How would you respond to them? And Taylor, you're first.
So maybe I'll take those separately. So let's
Sure.
talk about MBTA. I'm guessing they're specifically talking about the Waverly neighborhood because they were the
Yes, they
Yeah.
are going to be the most heavily impacted.
Yeah, so the state put a requirement in the law that 50% of all the acreage in 50% of all the acreage in a town's MBTA Communities Act plan has to be in one contiguous neighborhood. I don't know why they put that in there. That seems counterproductive to me, but they did. And part of the whole exercise that we did in Belmont is comply with the law. We could not be talking about economic development in 2025 if we were not in compliance with the MBTA Communities Act. So unfortunately, it had to be somebody. The MBTA Communities Act Advisory Committee came up with Waverly, and that's the planning board kind of went with that. With Belmont Center, here's the thing. The planning board doesn't change zoning. We just do due diligence, and we bring it to town meetings. So nobody's powerless. If they don't like it, they can tell their town meeting representatives, vote no on this proposal.
Okay, all right, interesting perspective, thank you. Paul, what are your thoughts?
So I served on the MBTA Advisory Committee for 2 years. I was a key proponent of trying to protect as much commercial as we possibly could. There were a number of motions that were made during the time that I was on the committee by myself to take out the Star Market, to ensure that those key commercial parcels weren't going to be included in an MBTA. I ultimately voted against the committee's final recommendation because of the inclusion of the Pure Coat area. And I was very pleased when you, Taylor, and Carol, and Roy came together and took that area out and repositioned that area into the 7th Precinct, where I live. I think that mixed-use development on Belmont Street is a win-win for this town and a win-win for our precinct. But as it relates certainly to state mandates, this is a part about the affordability crisis that we have across this entire state and area. And so this is the state's attempt to try to legislate or mandate these, increasing affordability, especially on the housing issue, in a way that is responsible.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hot button issue popped up in the press fairly recently, thanks to our neighbors in Cambridge. Would you support eliminating single-family zoning in Belmont? Paul, you're going to start.
So I live in a 2-family on Harvard Road. I typically really enjoy our neighborhood in the 7th Precinct. I would not favor the elimination of single-family housing within the town. I do think that as it relates to our individual neighborhood, it's an amazing neighborhood. I wouldn't trade it for anything. Their kids have friends literally everywhere. But we also have space. We have Grove Park. We have Payson Park. We have those community-based assets. This is another part of housing and affordability and the livelihood of our community that actually makes is really important to consider. So the answer to my question for Cambridge, look, Cambridge is 50-50 commercial residential. They haven't developed nearly enough residential. They ought to be looking to Belmont as an example of a way to do residential development in a responsible fashion.
Interesting. Taylor, what are your thoughts?
So my short answer is no, I don't favor eliminating single-family zoning. And look, it's just like it's not usually how I look at problems. I'm much more of like a sliding scale kind of guy. So could we do more multifamily zoning in Belmont? Probably. One of the reasons that I moved to Belmont is I wanted my kids to live on a street where they had friends. And Belmont has density so that you can do that, right? You can have that kind of lifestyle. But I just don't know that a blanket solution is generally like a blanket solutions I have not seen very, very successful. And then there's also the question of context. Like Cambridge already has a ton of multifamily housing. They actually they're probably not eliminating that many single family districts by doing that, which is just not the case in Belmont.
Okay, interesting perspective from both of you. Thank you. Moving on to economic development, and you both have already sort of touched on what I've got here, but let's reiterate. We have empty storefronts and office buildings already in our major areas such as Cushing Square, Waverly Square, Belmont Center. What's the argument for building more until we fill these? And Taylor, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, so last summer, when we were looking at the MBTA Communities Act and considering more economic development, one of the first things we did was a market and fiscal analysis of Belmont as a whole. And we asked some questions about like, hey, everyone said we want more commercial, but what commercial could we actually attract? And so there are a few verticals that they identified that were favorable. One of them was surprisingly retail, that even though we have these high visibility vacancies, these like the CVS in Belmont Center, the place next to Tate, and the Bradford, the overall vacancy rate is 2.3%.
Okay.
And so that says to, and by the way, this is why we use data, right? Sometimes you get surprising
That is important.
results, and that number is also true for the region as a whole. So I think that if we build more retail spaces, they will get filled, and actually it will help the existing retail spaces, because one of the things in retail is that retail loves other retail.
True. All right. Paul, what are your thoughts?
One of the questions that it came up last night at the Belmont Belmont Center Association meeting was what category of businesses within Belmont have actually seen 3 consecutive years of declining sales? This is a critical question for me. I don't, quite frankly, know what the answer is, but we ought to be able to understand what lived experiences, what these local entrepreneurs are necessarily going through. So my economic development plan, number 1 is parking, which we've already mentioned. Number 2, we have to include hospitality within our zoning bylaw. This is really important. The analysis that the RKG did basically said that if you did a 50 or 100 room or 200 room hospitality unit, and I know this because my parents don't live here, my dad doesn't live here, is really critical and important, and that's a real opportunity. The last one, and this is a recommendation that's been going on for years, is the inclusion of an economic development coordinator. Like we need somebody that's actually looking out and recruiting many of these businesses.
Thank you.
Sure.
One more follow-on the economic development. We had a lot of conversation around the Pure Coat site when we were doing 3A. What are your thoughts on appropriate use of sites like this? Should we encourage this? Should we be concerned about the future of the Hill Estates? There are large parcels that now are, what's going to happen? I'd be interested in your thoughts. And Paul, I'll start with you.
One of the players that was on my soccer team this past season, they live in the Hill Estates. And when, the property obviously is for sale, it's 15 acres, it's 400 units. It's a lot of families, a lot of seniors that have lived there for a long time. They're concerned. And so from my perspective, we need to ensure that those units, that those families are able to stay within Belmont if they should so choose. So my opinion is we ought to encourage mixed use. I think the development opportunity at Pure Coat makes sense from an environmental remediation perspective, but we also have to look at infrastructure, transportation, stormwater, it's a flood area that's obviously of top concern.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you. Taylor, thoughts?
Yeah, sure. So I don't disagree with, similarly, my son has a friend, like a good friend that lives in the Hill Estates, and I get it when people say, hey, we're really worried about if we're about to be evicted, right? These people put roots down here too. The short answer is like, what should be done there? I don't know. One of the reasons that we started with Belmont Center as opposed to like Brighton Street is that whereas we have studied Belmont Center in detail, we have not done the same for Brighton Street. We don't know what could be done there. And it would be a mistake for us to rush that process before we've answered some of these questions that even Paul brought up.
Okay.
So.
All right.
But
very
to
good.
that point, we ought to be beginning that process now. If in fact we are to deliver some type of a rezoning solution to Brighton Blanchard by November, right?
Yeah.
And to me, that makes a huge amount of sense to begin that conversation today.
Yeah. I'm only one guy. I can only do so much at once.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But yes, but it is in the pipeline, and we will be pushing to have some kind of proposal before town meeting for the poll. That is our goal. I think we can do that.
Okay.
It just takes time.
Everything takes time.
Yeah.
Let's shift a little bit to budgets. And I've got kind of a long run up to this, and I asked the school committee candidates the identical question. So, the municipal school budget split has been a point of discussion for decades. The proposed FY26 school budget is $70.6 million, which is a 5.6% increase over this present year, and represents 65% of the town's available revenue. In contrast, the town departments collectively will only receive a 2.5% increase, representing about 35% of the available revenue. The other thing to remember is when we factor in employee benefits, capital and facilities expenditures, as well as the bonded debt for the schools, the school budget number jumps up to almost $106 million against the town's collective departments of about $56 million. That's setting the table. Now the question, how would you support the town departments in the budget process? And Taylor, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, I've already been super supportive of the town departments. One of the things that has come up consistently in planning has been just how short-staffed the Office of Planning and Building is. We basically have like one town planner and one building inspector, and they do everything. We asked a lot of them. So we've got an open rec for another planner, which should allow us to do more, achieve more of our goals faster. And I think that's how I approach these kinds of conversations. Like, where can we create value? Because that should be our top priority. I hear you on the split. I don't know that I usually think about problems that way because like my mortgage payment is higher than my car payment, and that doesn't mean I'm spending too much on my house and not enough on my car. Some things are just expensive, and that's true about the schools because they're extremely labor intensive, and the reality is it's a seller's market for teacher labor right now. So, I hear you, and I do advocate for.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Paul, what about your thoughts?
So I worked as a teacher for a number of years back in California, and I understand the challenges associated with being a teacher and a classroom teacher, as you do. The $106 million and the $56 million, this gets back to the affordability crisis that I think that we're all kind of suffering or getting through. Obviously, the reason why we are interested, Taylor and I, in economic development and the growth of this town is primarily because we want to ensure that both town and the school departments have the resources that they need. From the fire side and the police side and the municipal side, and certainly with regard to teachers. So in my opinion, the most important thing for us to do is to attempt to grow the overall size of the Belmont economy, which would enable us to therefore fight as it relates to affordability and to ensure that these numbers and the resources that the teachers need and the resources that our police and our fire and our municipal staff need to do the jobs that we expect them to do as residents are carried out.
Thank you. So how would you respond then to school department requests for more money than is already allocated to them in this budget that we're going to be talking about and passing in the springtime Paul?
Well, number one, I think that we got to return back to something that Jeff Lubian talked about a year ago, which is a fiscal compact. You know, he ran on that issue. Unfortunately, it hasn't gotten the time and attention. We haven't come up with a final resolution as it relates to the compact. If I was elected to be a member of the select board, this is going to be a top concern. We have to come to agreement, particularly as you laid out, the costs associated with with healthcare benefits across the table. I mean, those are things that continue to go up, and we absolutely have to honor our obligations to teachers, to firefighters, to everybody that's employed by the town.
Okay. Taylor?
Yeah, you know, I think the Collins Center report talked about a couple of key elements of this question. So number one, doing a revenue first budgeting model where we say this is how much money we have, and so before we even talk about what everybody wants, this is how much there is to go around, and backing into what we provide for from there. The second is multi-year budgeting, and this is a critical component that allows stability across all of our town departments, because we know roughly how much revenue we're going to get each year. It's going to be what we got this year plus 2.5% per year. And then the third thing they mentioned that we're still working on is generating other revenue sources. But you know, in terms of holding people accountable to their budgets, those first two dimensions is just that is 80% of the solution.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Also within budgeting, the topic of overrides. Everybody hears the word override, and they go a little crazy, and I'm going to include myself. So override is a hot button for everyone. What is your position on spacing, timing of overrides in an order of magnitude, not necessarily an actually dollar figure? What might we be looking at? And what kinds of things would you want to avoid as you start a discussion on an override? And Taylor, you're going to start.
Yeah, so look, I've knocked on over 1,000 doors in this campaign, and the number one issue by far is the tax burden that people share with me. And and I get it, right? It's we are a high tax town. You know, I can't answer the question of like what I think, how big I think the override should be or when it should be, because that's all context dependent. But what I can absolutely promise is I will be absolutely transparent about the trade-offs that we face. Like what service cuts are we going to actually suffer if an override doesn't pass, and how much do I think this thing actually needs to be to preserve the services that we want or invest in the services that we want. But when it should be, I think if we get lucky, it'll probably won't be for at least 3 years. But that's going to take a lot of fiscal discipline from all departments.
Very true. Thank you. Paul, what are your thoughts on overrides?
So with regard to the override that we had last year, I was in full support of the $8.4 million override last year. The challenge with that override, however, was the fact that we had to prepare two budgets, both the school and the town side. That took a lot of time, and it took a lot of effort, and there was a lot of uncertainty as to whether or not that override would actually pass. And so as it relates to future overrides, my opinion is we ought to avoid that type of circumstance in the future. It ought to be, and I'm going to stake my claim in this, there ought to be a November-based override season or vote. And it ought to be at a high midterm or election, large-scale election season, so that the majority of residents within this town are going to be engaged, they're going to turn out, and they're really going to have their say as it relates to future overrides.
Okay, interesting concept. Thank you. You mentioned seniors.
Yeah.
And I think if you talk to many seniors, they're focused on two issues. One, affordability, the ability to pay the taxes and afford them, but also senior housing, the lack of senior housing. I was with a group the other night, 4 of us widows, to a person talking about, I'm living in a big house, I really want to downsize, I don't want to leave town, but I'm starting to feel guilty because I'm preventing a young family from moving into my house, just like I did however many years ago. There have been numerous proposals for senior housing over the decades, most of them tanked by special interest groups. How do you respond to those two topics? taxation and availability of senior housing.
It all comes, is it my turn? Sorry.
Yes, it is. Good joy.
So
Good.
it all comes back down to affordability, right? I mean, we all hear the stories, like your taxes go up by $800 or $1,000. You're not going to go out as much. You're not going to go to dinner as much that year. And this is something that I think we seriously ought to consider as it relates to senior housing. I think ADUs are part of the solution. I think that the ability to build an ADU on your single family lot and certainly being able to rent that out to maybe my son Thomas when he graduates and is in college, or somebody else that's coming into Harvard for a short term, for 6 months or a year. And we ought to make that as easy as possible. But the last thing associated with seniors is senior tax relief. I saw the packet that came out, a week or two ago. We need to seriously have a way to inform seniors as to the best way that they can qualify for many of those programs moving forward.
Okay.
Yeah.
Taylor?
Sure. So let's start with senior tax relief. I know we're going to get information on that from the working group soon. I've talked to members of that working group, and they gave me 3 broad strokes that seem reasonable. Number one, we do have some existing, albeit small, programs that are not super well known and not super well understood, and we can do a better job of promoting and explaining those programs so that people can get some immediate relief. The second is we can reform those existing programs. They're right now probably not optimized to create the most tax relief opportunity for seniors. Yeah. And that is within our control. Long term, to get access to the meaningful tax relief that people really need, we're going to have to find ways to adjust the programs, possibly through home rule petitions, to change some of the requirements of the program. On senior housing, the tools that we have to create more is zoning again. We can zone things for senior housing and ADUs.
Thank you. All right, very good. I've just lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. All right, we're caught up with that.
Too excited
right?
about senior housing.
I just the thought of senior housing. I can't even control myself. Right. Let me change the subject again to my favorite topic, which is capital and capital projects. There's always capital projects to be done. No matter how long we live in Belmont and how much money we spend on things, there will always be capital projects. What I want to focus on just real quick is the DPW. That is the last facility in the grand scheme of things that has not been completely addressed. Yes, we did an addition and some renovations down there, which were completed in January of 2020, but they were a 10-year fix, and we were very clear with town meeting and with the community at the time, it was a 10-year fix. So that DPW needs to be completely rebuilt by 2030. Harris Track and Field is coming on. It's need to be refurbished. We have school roofs. We've got a number of other projects. Where will the money for capital projects come from? And is there a way to avoid debt exclusions to get these projects accomplished? And Taylor, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, so I think one of the best things that the appointed treasurer has done since our successful Yes for Appointed Treasurer campaign is create this capital stabilization fund and regularly fund it each year out of free cash. And I think that's kind of our main tool for defraying some of these capital costs and making it more realistic to do things, as they need to be done, as opposed to waiting until they're outright failing or maybe just expensive to fix. The unfortunate reality is, again, with the town does not have more money than it knows what to do with, and so other than tools like that, there are a few other options, and we just have to make hard choices.
Okay, Paul?
When the Cushing lot, when the Bradford was developed, there was a parking lot that was there.
Yes.
And that parking lot was sold, and the money went into capital.
Yes.
And it was put forward to the Butler School. Is that right? Or
not really, no.
Not really, no.
No,
Sorry.
close, but no.
It was put forward.
It was put into a fund,
Right.
and then it was used as seed money to begin the high school project
Right.
and DPW police project.
Apologies.
No, no problem.
But it was $1 million, and it went
Yes.
it went into capital. So I think, and this is something that Vision 21 has actually started to work on, is it relates to the selling of existing town parcels and to putting that into the existing capitalization fund established by the treasurer, and to help fill the gap between what we currently have and what, for example, the new DPW site would ultimately cost. One such example of this, and I will put it out there, is the parcel across the street from the Wellington. There are a number of other parcels within the town that I think that would be certainly could be looked at to basically allow us to afford for that really important project.
Right. I'm going to follow on now, just very quickly. You mentioned free cash. Would either of you be willing to commit that free cash goes to capital or one-time funds, not operating? And I'm not sure who goes first, Paul.
It's a great question. That certainly is an important recommendation that was made, I believe, by the Collins Center report. Is that
Even before Collins Center, the Capital
right.
Budget Committee was pleading with the Select Board to do that.
So I'm not willing to commit to that necessarily this afternoon, but I will certainly say that in most circumstances, as it relates to free cash, we ought to seriously look at being able to fund the Capital Stabilization Fund from the vast majority of funds available through that mechanism.
Yeah.
Taylor?
So again, I think I mentioned before, I don't generally like absolutist solutions. So I'm probably like Paul in that I won't commit to it, but the burden of proof to me is on whoever wants to use free cash for operating expenses. You know, the Collins Center was clear. One-time funds go to one-time expenses. And when you get out of that habit, you really, you get to some of these financial problems that we've been stuck with for years. And I'd like to see us get out of that cycle.
Okay. You both mentioned the Collins report. Yeah. The Collins report for a while now has been kind of held up as the municipal Bible. Not all of us would agree with that, but those people aren't running for office, so it's okay. As a result of the Collins report, we have done a lot of work on capital and money that's reserved for capital, but also we changed how we deal with assessors, treasurer. They went from elected to appointed. Yeah. We created an elected light board. And we also got out of civil service. We've also changed our budgeting. Off the top of your head, what would you name as top success and maybe not so successful based on what we've done with the Collins report recommendations? And Taylor, you go first.
Yeah, the only one that's really had the time to get baked in has been the treasurer. Those other, the civil service thing happened last fall, and then the assessors happened less than a year ago.
Right.
So I guess the jury's still out on those. But the treasurer, it has been remarkable. Everyone I've spoken to, all the volunteers in financial committees have had nothing but positive things to say about our new treasurer and how she conducts business, including, we talked about the Capital Stabilization Fund, including folks on the Warrant Committee. And some of the other things that she's done has just been things that I had assumed were already being done, right? And that's not to say the previous treasurer wasn't good, but it was just, this is what you get when you have
change.
fresh change, right? So I think the records have come in on her, and it has been wonderfully successful for the financial management of the town.
Okay, thank you. Paul, your thoughts?
Yeah, I certainly agree. I voted in favor of moving to an appointed treasurer. I think that it's been a phenomenal result, certainly for the town. The one thing that the Collins Center did point out, it relates certainly to growth. And this is, I think, one of the things that's been a little bit underlooked, and we're certainly trying our best in order to encourage overall growth within the town. But I think as it relates to where we are today, getting back to having an economic development coordinator, having a coordinated strategy for the town related to overall growth is something that's going to be quite critical and important moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Let me shift a little bit to committee appointments. Yeah. One of the roles of the Select Board is to appoint members to a wide variety of committees and boards. Recently, in some cases, some of those appointments have become a little bit contentious. Do we have too many committees? Is it too much for a Select Board to manage or oversee? And do you have any thoughts on how you would go about recruiting, vetting, analyzing those people who are appointed to some of these committees, particularly the higher profile ones like Planning Board, ZBA, CPA, and TAC Committee. And let's see, Paul, we're going to start with you, right? Yes.
This is a really good question. You know, when I was before the select board this past summer, obviously there was a situation that was obviously rather difficult. But we got through it, and I think everybody kind of learned from that situation and has come out better, certainly on the other side. As it relates to our more high-profile boards, the Planning Board, the ZBA, et cetera, I believe in a transparent process. I believe in having an actual portal system that works. Mm-hmm. Right now, every time you apply to be a part of a committee, the portal system you have to recycle, et cetera, again and again.
Exactly, rewrite and rewrite. Yeah, and I think that discourages people.
The other thing, too, relates to the recommendations of the chair, but also the recommendations of the overall committee. The Economic Development Committee has always held an open and transparent process for our own applicants, and we always take positions before we make a recommendation to the select board. And every committee, certainly, or every board ought to perhaps do the same thing.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Taylor, what do you think?
Yes, let's see. Your first question was, do we have too many committees?
Yes, you can respond to that or not, but it's just a throwaway.
I feel like that's a dangerous road to go down.
Yeah, I know, right.
You're going to ask me
Which
who needs to go. Yeah.
I promise I won't ask.
So I mean, I don't know. I know that that has come up, that maybe we have too many committees, and the challenge when you have responsibility diffused too far is that no one has to take any responsibility for anything. In terms of how the select board should be recruiting people, my first stopping place is always town meeting, and there's two benefits to that. Number one, giving town meeting members a say in the committee work, which develops the policies that we vote on at town meeting, helps town meeting members feel like they have an opportunity to shape it before they have to vote on it up or down, right? So that's, and not only that, it's like our baseline group of engaged people in town, right? There's 288 members. We can get, that is how I got involved in things like the planning board and the appointed treasurer campaign and the Vision 21 committee. People said, hey, it sounds like you have something interesting to say about this. And they reached out to me directly.
Perfect. All right. Thank you. Staying a little bit on that, roles of the select board and administration and how they dovetail, what do you see as your relationship as a select board member with the town administrator? And Taylor, we'll start with you.
Sure. So maybe I'll describe my relationship with the town planner, because I think it's a pretty
comparable.
Pretty
Sure.
comparable.
That's
Not
fine.
perfect, but comparable. So my job as the chair of the planning board is to, one, pull together the planning board and understand what direction we want to go in, and then push everything in that direction. When you do that, though, I feel it's like a wise move in leadership is to turn to your subject matter expert and say, here's where I want to go. What do you think? Right? And I've gotten phenomenal feedback. Chris Ryan is just an awesome town planner. So in terms of, but I also hold him accountable. I say, hey man, I know you think X, Y, and Z, but the planning board thinks A, B, and C, and we're in charge, right? I think the same thing goes with, say, a town administrator. Of the select board is, the select board is the voice of Belmontonians. The town administrator is a subject matter expert who should inform the best course of action, but does not get to direct the course of action.
Okay. Paul, thoughts?
One of the things that we do at Dr. Carlisle, the company that I work for, is a voice of the employee every year. And this is really critical and important, certainly, to our CEO. And he says every year we want people to be open and honest as possible. It's impossible for every single person that serves on the select board to have strong relationships with each and every town employee. So I think having these type of annual surveys as it relates to the overall performance of all the department heads is actually quite critical and important, especially as it relates to things that you can't keep up on. But ultimately, in my opinion, I think that level of transparency is quite critical. But ultimately, it's about serving the residents in the best way possible that we can, given the resources that we have available, certainly, to us.
Okay. I tried to think a little bit of how I wanted to phrase this question. Basically, the topic is, what is the role of the select board? And so my question is, what is your understanding of the role of the select board? And I use the analogy, are you the bus drivers or are you the traffic cops? Are you playing a leading role in getting the town to where it needs to be, or are you directing and organizing the traffic that will get us there? Maybe that's not a great analogy, but I'm looking for your general understanding of the role of the select board. Paul, we'll start with you.
So the number one thing as it relates to this question is tackling the key crisis or the key questions and challenges of all the residents. The select board is and of by itself the only townwide elected executive body of the entire town. And so what residents are interested in, what their key priorities are, what their challenges are related to affordability, like we've talked about over the course of this debate, that really matters. The second thing as it relates to the role of the select board is to implement the needs and wishes and aspirations of the residents in a way that is responsible with the resources that are available to the town. And so it's connecting both parts of that in a direction and with a story and with some type of a strategy, logic, in order to move us into through this particular time period.
Okay, thank you. Taylor.
Yeah, I mean, it's the honest answer is probably a little bit of both driving the bus and directing the traffic, but maybe to break that down. So, I look at the work I've been doing on economic development, right? And that is in no small part because Select Board Chair Elizabeth Dion and Select Board Vice Chair Matt Taylor have been vocal advocates of economic development, and they ran on it, so they speak with that voice of the voters that gives authority and a little bit of encouragement to folks like me down the line to implement that agenda. So that's probably the driving the bus component of what you're talking about. A lot of what the select board does, though, is just strictly managerial and executive. So issuing liquor licenses and making committee appointments, which is, it's also important, and that is the way that Belmontonians have said they want it to be done. So, I think if I were on the select board, I would say, hey, here's the clear things that I want to get done, but also I got to take care of the day-to-day work.
Yeah, right. Very good.
Can I remember that?
Absolutely, yes.
So one of the questions that the Belmont Voice came out and asked both of us related to in what way would you improve the experience or improve the operations of those meetings? They go quite late into the night. And one of the suggestions certainly that I had, I don't know if you agree, but number one, we ought to have a real consent agenda so that you don't have to go through item by item by item. You just say, I don't have any questions, let's move on.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of how we run things. We probably don't call it a consent agenda, but that is kind of how we run things at the planning board. You'll hear me go do the round robin. Do you have any questions? Do you have any questions? Do you have any questions? No? Okay, let's move on. And yeah, that to me, meeting facilitation has done a lot to improve planning board meetings. And I think the select board meetings, it's probably the same flavor of solution.
Right. And I think other committees do what you do. I can remember even back to my days on the school committee, there was always a consent agenda. So it's a useful tool.
Yeah.
But we also could do more. I mean, we could take public comment at the beginning of a meeting, and we could certainly take it as it relates to individual topics. But we could also allow for public comment at the end of the meeting as well, if people really wanted to stick it out and to make a comment after everything has been said and done.
Yeah.
That could be in addition to having a real kind of consent agenda that you go through and you say, okay, we don't need to discuss this. We've already had a discussion. Let's move on.
Okay, thank you. If elected, what would you look forward to doing? What's that one thing in the back of your head? Boy, I would love to do this. And we're going to start with you, Taylor.
Oh, that's a good question. All right, well, I'll start with this. I have actually really enjoyed this process of campaigning and talking directly to voters. We don't do polling in Belmont, so when I'm chairing the planning board, I'm often playing this guessing game of what do I think everybody in Belmont wants, not just the people that are in this room. And being that advocate for the voters and the residents of the town, I would get so much joy out of, because I think that the role that people want us to fill is, hey, we're sending you to town government to do a job. I've got other stuff in my life that I want to take care of, but I'm trusting you to do it. And fulfilling that responsibility, it's just, to me, it's like putting the service in public service, and that motivates me.
Okay. Paul?
Glad you used the word joy. It's
I-
a great word. I don't
Good
own it.
segue.
But that being said, it relates to what I enjoy, what I look forward to the most. This is a time of transition and change. There's a lot of uncertainty as it relates to the overall economy. There's a lot of uncertainty related to the financial and the affordability crisis across Greater Boston. And one of the things that I'm really quite interested in doing as it relates to running for this position is sinking my teeth into these larger, more holistic, more challenging issues and delivering results for the town in a way that will basically measure up not just in 1 year or 2 years, but 5 or 10 or 100 years into the future. And there's some real decisions that need to be made over the next 3 to 5 years that will have an outsized impact over the next 50 years within this town. And that's really what I kind of look at and look forward to.
Okay. Quality of life. Are we losing our small town character? We're being choked by traffic. We're doing some dramatic zoning changes. We're trying to look at development, whatever. Are we going to lose our small town character? Paul, I'm going to start with you.
It's a great question. When I first fell in love with Belmont, it was sitting at Grove Park and it was watching kids play soccer. And that's when I think I realized, moving from California, that this isn't Cambridge, it's not Harvard Square, it's not downtown Boston. There's a certain quality to the neighbors, there's a certain quality to the relationships that you're able to build within this town that is above and beyond anything that I've ever experienced anywhere else in the world where I've lived. And so my answer to you, Mary, is basically no. I think that we can still retain our common decency. Taylor and I are friends, for goodness sake. And yet we're able to come out and have a meaningful and robust debate in a way that respects each other and respects all of you, the voters of Belmont. So no, I don't believe that we're going to be losing that anytime soon.
Okay. Taylor?
Yeah, my answer is mostly no. I don't think we're going to lose our small town charm, even with some of the changes that have been mooted for the town. And I will just lay out that change just happens anyways. And it's really just a question of, do we want change that we choose or change that will be foisted upon us? And I'm very much an advocate for the former, to say like, hey, what are the things that make Belmont great? How do we enhance those and add to those? And we talked about Belmont Center earlier, and I'll just use one example out of that. One of the things that we've been advocating for in the planning board is this cannot look like the Seaport, right? That's not what we're going for. And there are tools at our disposal to make sure that happens. And the onus is on the town's leadership and the town's volunteers to advocate for the kind of change that we actually want.
Okay. We have 1 minute left, so I'm going to ask each of you for maybe 20 seconds as we wrap up this debate. May you live in interesting times, a curse or a blessing for the select board? Oh. Taylor, what do you think?
So
20
quote,
seconds.
20 seconds?
That's it. 20 seconds. Curse or a blessing?
Yeah, I want to live in interesting times, right?
Okay.
Maybe I'm a glass half full kind of guy, but that sounds good to me.
All right, Paul?
We absolutely live in truly transformative times in 2025, moving into 2030 and beyond. This is going to be one of the most challenging and critical time periods, I think, in the last 100 years. And we really need to be able to have leadership that gets it right.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been fascinating, and I think our viewers are going to maybe watch this a couple of times before Election Day. This has been the Select Board Candidate Debate. I urge all of you to go out and vote on April 1st. One of these gentlemen is going to become your next Select Board member. Thank you. I'm Anne Marie Mahoney. This has been a great debate.